Hello, welcome to the Sports Philanthropy Podcast. I am your host, Roy Kessel, and today we are very excited to have with us Dr. Akilah Carter-Francique, who is the Executive Director for the Institute for the Study of Sports, Society, and Social Change at San Jose State University. Dr. Akilah, welcome to the show.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
We're very excited to have you with us today. I love your virtual backdrop there. It's one of the fun toys in Zoom is all these different backgrounds that we can create.
Yes, I'm still learning, but it's been fun.
I think we all are with this craziness that's been going on as we record this during the COVID era. But
Yeah.
I know that you do some really interesting work at San Jose State, and we want to talk about that. But I thought it would be great for our listeners to get a little bit of your background before we go there and have you tell us kind of, educationally how you got started, and as you started working, what drew you to this type of role.
Oh my gosh. Educationally, well, just to give a little backstory, I was born and raised in Topeka, Kansas. And so growing up there to parents that were K-12 educators that worked in the 501 school district was very significant to my upbringing and, I think how I got where I am today, in the sense of they were there in that space and time to sort of carry out the legacy and the efforts of those from the 1954 Brown v. Board of Education. And so with that sort of monumental legislation, the work that they did coming into that school district as teachers, as administrators, and as parents raising young children did a lot to shape who I was and understanding the importance of race and access to education and equal education. And so from there, growing up in that space, I also got involved in sports at a young age. I have an older brother who's 5 years older than me and was heavily into track and field. And I was little sister running around. And so I picked up, being involved in track and field and other sports as well. But that ultimately sort of led me to eventually being, recruited in high school and competing at the University of Houston. So while at University of Houston, again, still competing in track and field, was a double major in exercise science, kinesiology, exercise science, as well as psychology. And I think at that time, I really don't know what I wanted to be, but I knew it had to be something involving exercise, fitness, and really the psychology, I think, was a way to help myself through my own physical challenges. I had a knee dislocation. And so I was kind of going through being a college athlete and being injured. And so again, as a double major, it was an opportunity to continue to get involved in sport and really just kind of learn its history, but also, again, learn more about me and my journeys. And so upon graduation, I graduated, didn't know what I wanted to do. Spent a small stint in K-12 education, working as a counselor. And then upon that point, after working in that space and also working at the high school level coaching, I knew that I wanted to be an educator. I wanted to use sport as my way to educate others, help others get to the next level. So I eventually ended up at the University of Georgia, pursuing my master's degree, and again, kinesiology, exercise science, with a focus on administration as well. As I was doing that simultaneously while working in Georgia's, our campus rec department. And I ran a outdoor field space as well as our indoor weight room facility in our campus rec area. And again, sport was still rich and a rich involvement for me, and something that I knew that I still wanted to continue down that road. And so after getting my master's degree, took a little break, was walking around a store, saw this book called The New Plantation, The Colonization of the Black Student Athlete. And the gentleman that wrote it was Dr. Billy Hawkins, who I would soon find out was also in residence at University of Georgia. We started talking, and eventually I started my doctorate under his guidance and his leadership and his mentorship. And so I obtained in 2008, completed my doctorate in sports studies. And my focus at that time was on Black female college athletes and identity negotiation, what it meant to be Black, female, and in sport, in college sport, particularly at predominantly white or historically white institutions. So that just sort of led me, from an educational standpoint, that was my path. Had the opportunity to work at a few universities, historically white institution, historically Black institution, and then now I'm at San Jose State, working in this space now. Never saw it coming, but I think it was one of those things where I just tell people, I said, I just kept doing the work, talking about women, talking about people of color, talking about athletes, and helping to spread the knowledge and awareness of experiences they've had of marginalization, of inequities, and of those experiences that really were not in their favor, but they overcame. And so this platform, by being at San Jose State University, running the Institute for the Study of Sport, Society, and Social Change, which again started in 2017 with its co-creator, the Dr. Harry Edwards, allows that legacy to continue. The legacy of the work that he did with Dr. Ken Noel at San Jose State, and the Olympic Project for Human Rights, and the efforts that Tommie Smith and John Carlos and a number of other athletes at the 1968 Olympic Games were able to stand up and spread the message of that racial inequality is happening and it's not fair. So.
Well, and as we look around what's going on in the country right now, it's obviously a hot topic right now. I think one of the challenges and one of the concerns I always have in this environment is, how do we make sure that this conversation doesn't go away, right? It gets a lot of attention the last 2 weeks. It's going to have a lot of attention for the next month, okay? Mm-hmm. But now, let's say as this COVID crisis lessens, as people get back to a little bit more of a normal lifestyle, a little bit more with ongoing sports activities and everything else going on, how do we make sure that this doesn't just remain a conversation, but that we can really turn it into some tangible action and some meaningful change?
I think it, starts with people like yourself, people like me, people in spaces and places that have a platform to continue the conversation, to make sure that we don't lose focus and lose the momentum that we have. It also is one in talking with other groups, be it athletic departments at the high school or college level, be it in speaking with other groups and organizations, that we understand that there's an education that needs to come with it. And it's not a one-off, let me check the box and get this training, but that it is an ongoing conversation that needs to take place to build understandings. The notion of racial inequality, the notion of racism is extremely complex. It is systemic. And so there's a lot of unpacking that needs to happen, of understanding how it came to be, and then work that needs to go into it about how to dismantle it. And so I've been, it's been a fortunate situation in the sense that, some athletic departments and coaches have reached out over the past week, and I've had an opportunity to speak with even their athletes. And speaking with those young athletes made me aware that there's a lot of history that they don't know, not just from a sport perspective, a sport and race perspective, but there's a lot of history that still needs to be introduced to them, that's education that needs to take place. So by expressing that it is an ongoing process, and it is not, again, one that we can just check a box, but we need to have continual, consistent education that's ongoing, week after week, month after month, to help those understand and again find a pathway, identify strategies, organize ways to dismantle racism that's going on in the country.
You raised an interesting point in terms of you communicating with athletes from other campuses. Mm-hmm. And I think one of the challenges that I've seen over the years of being involved in the sports business world and representing athletes trying to get into the NFL is there's often a significant disconnect between what that school thinks is going on its campus and what the players in that program feel. Right. And it's you see it coming out right now at the University of Iowa with the reports of what's been going on with their strength and conditioning coach and some of the statements and some fairly strong responses from former athletes at Iowa as to what's been going on there for quite a period of time. It's surprising to me that the communication internally is of such a different nature that you would be, in a sense, as an organization, as an institution, tone deaf, where you're not going to hear that that's going on. And in that respect, I'm talking now not about somebody who makes what we would all agree is a mistake, a terrible reference, using inappropriate language in one instance, but I'm talking more ongoing nature of communication and treatment. Mm-hmm. It's interesting to me to hear about how you look at that. I know you focused a lot of your work on women and how they're dealing with that. Do you see a different level of treatment of the Black female athletes than the Black male athletes?
Yes, I mean, they both are marginalized in those spaces, but at the same time, they're in some returns, particularly with our revenue-producing sports, are celebrated and put on a platform because of their athletic prowess, their athletic excellence. But when it comes to their academic engagement, there's not a lot of celebration there. There's not a lot of advocacy for helping those young people identify academic majors and identify majors that are going to help them get a job and obviously a career following their athletic tenure in those spaces. So those are sort of the initial, controversies or challenges of being a Black student athlete in those spaces and places. As it relates to women, celebrated to a point. Again, revenue producing sports, typically you're going to find Black female athletes in that space and highly populated in the sport of basketball and track and field. That's from a historical perspective, and still contemporary perspective is very relevant today. But they're often facing a different, unique challenges, not only based on their race, but also because of their gender. They experience marginalizations that are to the place that they are invisible in many cases, or they are silenced in many cases, and that we don't necessarily want to hear from you. We don't necessarily want to see you and see you as your full self. And so those are those challenges that Black women experience at that intersection of race and gender. And then when we begin to sort of unpack the layers and peel the layers back, if you will, based on the sport they're in, they're going to experience marginalization based on socioeconomic status, their sexual orientation, how they're built, just their body politic, if you will, being muscular, how their hair is, if they're wearing their hair natural versus having a relaxed hairstyle, or things that are deemed more acceptable by the powers that be, if you will, or by dominant society, based on white or Eurocentric standards of beauty. Those are the challenges that those women face. If we look historically of experiences that the women at Rutgers experienced during the time of Don Imus, those communications, I believe it was 2007, and that championship game, they experience so much, oh my gosh, so much marginalization, just being yelled at with racial epithets. And that is one of those things that mom and dad don't necessarily prepare you for. Coach doesn't necessarily prepare you for, but they've endured those things. Many of them, I believe, have overcome, but it stays with you. It haunts you. There is a trauma that takes place due to that. And unfortunately, again, this speaks to the notion of being invisible, of being silenced, and that we don't know those stories, that we don't hear much follow-up about how they're doing today. Where on the other end, we often hear about some of those challenges from those Black male athletes. Again, revenue-producing sport. We're going to highlight those. We're going to tell those stories because athletics is a front porch of our universities in many cases, and we want to make sure that we're continuing to bring in income. And part of that income is the labor of that Black male athlete. So.
And that's what's really interesting is you talk about the fact of the women being marginalized, and you bring up Don Imus, and you look at some of the other things that are going on or have gone on around that time frame. Most of the stories that you hear and most of the complaints that you hear coming out about the language and about the treatment are in the male revenue generating sports, right? It's primarily in football and basketball where you hear it. Once in a while, you'll hear about somebody in a different sport, whether it's soccer or track or cross country or something else, but you don't hear a lot from any of those other sports. And obviously the mainstream media, ESPN, Fox, right, they're going to focus on the revenue generating sports, but it's hard to believe that the treatment either on campus or by coaches would be of such a different nature that it only occurred in the revenue generating sports.
You do feel it, I guess, more so in the revenue generation, but again, and even non-revenue. So when we're talking about from, again, Black female perspective, those young women that are in sports that aren't considered sort of acceptable for Black women, such as tennis, such as golf, such as gymnastics. And you can, much of what, if we think of Althea Gibson and the challenges that she faced during her era, these young women today are still facing some of those challenges. Again, she was a great success as a golfer and a tennis player. We know that historically, but even some of our young women today, they're not getting recruited necessarily to play golf, to play tennis. But even if we go back a step further and think of K-12 education and having access to tennis programs, having access to golf programs that would prepare them and put them in a place to be recruited, those things aren't necessarily taking place. So we often have, again, low participation numbers of Black women in a golf, in a tennis, in a gymnastics, in a swimming. And for those women in those spaces and places that there's usually one of them, I always wonder, how are you doing? How are you managing? How are you coping? And those experiences that I've been able to unearth, along with even some of my colleagues, other women in sport, Black women in sport in particular, that write on those experiences. You hear those stories of people asking, can I touch your hair? Or not understanding, why don't you wash your hair as often? Or not understanding why some, venues or cities that they go to participate, that their teammate doesn't seem as comfortable. Or, what they are experiencing being the only one in many of these team situation standpoints, or again, on campus, as one of few Black women athletes on campus. And so there's numerous challenges. There's a lot to speak of as it relates to mental health in that respect, and that there have been some cases of young women that are dealing with the trauma that's so deep that it's often subjected to them to taking their own life. And so those are the stories that are hard to hear, but at the same time, they're not widely known. And so I continue to do work in that space to uplift those young people, those young women, and help them understand. But, I'm but one person. And so I think it is a message of spreading that information to coaches, to athletic trainers, to parents of those young women, to those young women themselves, to helping them understand that you are of value, you are of importance, and we need to do better to work to support you and your overall development, not just as an athlete, but as a whole being, including your race, including your gender, your sexual orientation, your religious affiliation, so that they can, again, go on to be leaders as we know they can be. And that's, again, what sport can do for all those that participate.
Yeah, it's disturbing that there are so many stories, and probably even more disturbing that the stories aren't known, because as you described in terms of what goes on, the challenge is, how do you educate that next generation of women and of coaches, right? Black, white, all races, all genders, about the issues that have gone on. Because if you don't learn about the history of what's been going on and you don't have the opportunity to know, I think there's times, and I think one of the struggles now in our society is people trying to differentiate things that are done out of ignorance without malice, and things that are pure hatred and racism. And oftentimes those can look similar if you just look at the one particular action, and you don't have any context. And it's very challenging to look at, what can we do as, on our end as an organization, what can we do as a society to make sure that we have enough education out there so that it no longer becomes difficult to determine which side somebody's on, because everybody should have enough knowledge and education on these basic issues. And I think the work that you're doing is very important. And it's always interesting to me of what can we do to support that? Members of our network, organizations that we work with, how can we support that message that you're talking about and disseminate it into more places?
I think it's one where, again, we continue to have those conversations of the importance of diversity and inclusion. And yes, definitely getting that training. I think it's one where we talk about that those courses also need to be in our educational programs, starting as early as high school, and starting even, in undergrad in those respective majors, definitely having it from a graduate school perspective. But oftentimes it goes deeper than diversity and inclusion. I think that's maybe a first step, because then we have to begin to, again, dig deeper and look at some of those nuances of what it means to be culturally competent. And there's trainings of that are definitely available as well. In addition to cultural competence, we've got to think about race equity training as we start to get in some of the specifics, gender equity. When we talk about LGBTQ equity, there's trainings that can begin to break down those aspects as well. And there definitely needs to be a connection from that mental health perspective. One of the things that I've done and just in the past year or so too is got my certification in mental health first aid. And I couple that with the education that I already have to be able to understand some of the nuances when we talk about mental health, because if we begin to understand this notion of diversity, if we end to understand different cultural practices and sort of traditions and ways of being, we will begin to understand, even from a mental health standpoint, that while these may be some of the warning signs, it may not manifest that way for a Black woman like it would for a Black man. It may not manifest that way in comparison to a white female. There are different nuances. In the work that I've done, I've looked at some of those coping mechanisms, and it's often one where, at least from my studies and working with those Black women, it was an avoidance strategy. It's like, I'm not going to confront you. I don't want to communicate with you. And oftentimes just sort of retreating into their own spaces and trying to handle it on their own, not speaking up, because again, those stereotypes of loud Black girl take over, one of complaining, one of you just need to deal with it, as to really beginning to understand that this is a cry for help from a young woman. And so I think there is, again, it can start with the notion of diversity and inclusion, but it has to have some additional ongoing layers of different discussions that get at some of those different nuances. I think it's one too where, support, in that coaches are great at coaching, as I say. I think those trainings can definitely help them, but it's also bringing in individuals that can serve as allies and other supports to a team, to an athletic department that can help those young people that are, again, they're oftentimes removed from home. I kind of use the work of my major professor, Dr. Billy Hawkins, talking about this notion of the oscillating migrant labor, where those young people are moving from places, for example, like Florida to Iowa. And what does that mean when you're removed from your hometown, your culture, your church, your family, into a space where you've got one beauty salon, that can support them. So by identifying people within your university, by identifying people within your surrounding community that look like these young people, that can serve as additional support and a support network to these young people, is something that I encourage. So a few years ago, I was working at a university, Texas A&M University, and I started a program there with a colleague of mine, Dr. Denise Dortch, and we call it Sister to Sister, where we did that such thing. The athletic department, one of their administrators, I spoke with them and they allowed me the opportunity to come in and start this program with these young women. And we work with them once a month. And it was just a matter of finding a safe space, or brave space, some call it, to sit and have conversations about them, about what challenges they were experiencing as athletes on their respective teams, about challenges they were experiencing while in their classrooms and pursuing their academic major and looking for that career in life after college, about challenges they were experiencing just day to day, the microaggressions that they faced as they walked about campus, as they stepped off campus to go to dinner or go to the grocery store. They were faced with a lot of challenges, again, with some of these colleges that are in probably rural spaces, college towns, where the racial population is small. They're facing, again, these daily interactions that aren't always positive. And so because of that, they stay close to home, they stay close to their team, they don't venture out, and it becomes challenging. Again, that's not just for the Black women, but also for the Black men, because as long as they have that uniform top on, they're cheered. But the minute they take it off and they're not identified with the university, they're deemed as a threat. And I think those are some of the things we're seeing come into head even over this past week with the racial unrest that's taken place and the number of protests.
Yeah, it's interesting when you bring up the fact that they're cheered with the uniform on, but when somebody runs into them the rest of the time around campus, right, they're typically treated either, as you're saying, a celebrity, or they're not treated well or incorporated in other ways, right? If they saw, in many communities, if you see a young student who is an upperclassman and getting ready to graduate, and they meet alums, that person might be offering them internships, they might be helping them find jobs or make connections. One of the complaints I've often heard from in a lot of different campuses, I'm in Chicago, so many of them are Big Ten campuses, is just exactly that they're not getting those opportunities to interact at the same level. And I know there's some schools that started programs specifically targeted at that, called Beyond the Game, where they would bring athletes, former athletes in, or high profile former athletes. And one time we were listening to Spencer Tillman talk, and this was up at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, which is my hometown. And his comment was very interesting. He called out all the athletes because they had come to this event and they sat at tables together instead of going to sit at tables with some of the business people in the community and some of the alums. And he specifically said, no, get up. I want everybody to get up. I want people to move around. I want 2 athletes at every table. He said, you're here. Forget why the other people are here to meet you, but you're here because your job as an athlete is to make as many contacts and connections as you're able to do during the time that you're in school. And you're at a place where you're being given this opportunity. So take advantage of it. Don't squander it. And he's kind of like pointing his finger at him and saying, I don't ever want to hear you say that the school took advantage of you. I want you to come in with the mindset that you're going to take advantage of the school to every extent possible. And it is a shift. I think back to the days when I was in college. I probably didn't go do those things as a student. Now, I may have had access to them before being a student and after, so maybe it wasn't as important because that's where I grew up, and I grew up in a family connected to the university. But I think that too often when you talk to athletes when they're done with their career or when they're in a professional league, they'll tell you that they wish they had been given more direction and more latitude while they're in school to pick their curriculum, not based on you can't have class on a Friday afternoon because we're going to have road trips, or you can't have class at this time because that's when you've got weightlifting, and so on. But to really be able to pick a curriculum that gets them somewhere other than plain eligibility so that they can play their sport. And I think that's a hidden measure that's very hard to detect from the outside.
I agree. There is that hidden curriculum, as we call it. And so I think I was fortunate in my respect in that when I got recruited, I had a brother that was 5 years older than me, that was recruited and spent his athletic career at the University of Florida. So I had a little insight going into it during my time. But I think, again, it is that hidden curriculum. It is being able to understand all of the nuances of what it takes to be a college athlete and how to take advantage of what it means and what all that being a college athlete can offer. But the other challenges come to the side of what it takes from an NCAA standpoint, or what their guidelines and parameters are with regards to academics and choosing that academic major. There's, I think I went back and forth with my degree maybe 3 times of what I wanted to do. But the students these days don't have that luxury because they have, APR to deal with. They have these other rules called 40, 60, 80, where they have to complete their degree, and so much of their degree every year. And so if you switch out of an identified academic major, you're going to lose credits. You're going to perhaps jeopardize your eligibility and the opportunity to play. I think there's a whole education that needs to take place prior to, coming to that college level platform that needs to happen at the high school level. I definitely see a disconnect when it comes to high schools understanding the dynamic of college athletics. And so in some senses, our athletes are set up for failure upon signing that letter of intent. And so education has to come. I think, again, it does come back to that notion of network, of having those individuals that, yes, our coaches can definitely speak to that. Our academic advisors in athletic can speak to that. But those academic advisors from the academic side of things, other faculty that are on staff can definitely help support them. Other staff members, when we talk about student activities, when we talk about career services, that can also serve as support networks in addition to athletics, because athletics likes to be siloed and let me do everything myself. that can also help in the holistic development of those young people. And so by having all of those individuals have a seat at the table and serve as additional support for that student athlete, I think you're setting them up for a better situation to where when they do have those events, as you mentioned, those networking sessions, those roundtables, they're better prepared to understand how I can best leverage myself as a student athlete, right? Athlete pursuing this academic major, and take my talents and skills and understand, I was a team captain, that's a leadership role, and that they can put that on their resume as the leadership that they've done. Or I did some service through the team that talks about community service and volunteering. And so their skill sets that they have obtained by being an athlete, on the field, on the court, in the pool, on the track, but also in their service for the athletic department, that are transferable to that resume as they're looking for jobs and careers post undergraduate degree completion. And for many of them, they're able to even capitalize on graduate school, because these days we know in most cases you have to have a graduate degree to kind of pursue some careers and sort of move up those ranks. But we need to educate them prior to getting to college. And again, definitely that freshman year, to say, hey, this is our end goal, and these are the ways that you can get there. And yes, you have athletics to pursue, but there are other things along the way that we definitely want you to obtain, and skill sets we want you to obtain as we move along the way. And we'll have some of those programs for you. And if we don't have them, we're going to give you information about programs that are going on across campus, which is definitely, again, what I try to do through my Sister to Sister program. So it wasn't just about knowing what athletic programs or sponsored programs were available, but those campus-wide, those in the surrounding community, and those, again, even in their academic major, to be a part of those particular associations that would help them create other networking opportunities to build their own career and brand beyond athletics.
You raise a whole array of points, and I think that the NCAA issues are significant. Mm-hmm. We could probably spend 3 entire shows just dealing with the defects in the NCAA system, and that would just be a small summary of the problem. Right. You look at the initial eligibility requirements and how many of the students are coming out of high school systems where they're not even given the opportunity to really get qualified in a sense. Mm-hmm. You look at how many of the coaches and athletes will tell you that they encourage the student athlete to get their education, but as you said, to a large extent, it's as long as you're not interfering with your real job, which is to play sports, right? So you're not interfering with your training and your practice and meetings and things like that. And then I think too infrequently they're not given the resources that exist on these large campuses where many of them are playing football and basketball that could address some of these issues. But in part, it's because they go into this sort of athletic silo, almost an athletic quarantine. You look at a lot of the schools, they've got specific dorms, they've got specific training and educational facilities and tutoring facilities. And again, it's designed to help. It's designed to be there so that you can make sure that the athletes are getting the support that they need. But at the same time, you're isolating them from the larger campus experience, because now, aside from everything else, right, you're making all their study halls and all of their tutoring sessions and everything in an environment where they're only dealing with athletes. And many of them will leave campuses hardly having experienced, we'll call it the typical student lifestyle.
Right. It's definitely challenged. Again, I reflect upon, whenever having these conversations, I do reflect upon my experience. And it was a quite unique one. Again, being at the University of Houston and under the direction of Tom Tellez, and later Leroy Burrell, we had more of a familia type atmosphere. And I remember one of the things that Coach Tellez said to us upon our entry. He said, if you want to be here, great. You come to practice, do what you need to do. If you don't want to be here, that's okay. You know, so we didn't feel that we were sort of tethered to athletics, and we had more of an opportunity, I feel personally, to explore things beyond our athletic competition. And from that, I made great friends that were, yes, athletes, but I also had those that were non-athletes, all about campus and other Greek letter organizations and other networks within my major and through other campus programs that were put on. Today we have, if you will, a facilities arms race. And so many of these institutions are building grand facilities, but within those facilities takes a lot of space. So student athletes are often geographically separated. And so they don't have to interact with one another. Your football stadium is one place. And again, their locker rooms are housed there. Computers are there for them if they need to study. They can stay in that one space all day if they need to and get things that they need done, unless to venture out to go to class. Basketball facilities are set up that same way, to the point that they have places where they can get their hair cut, like little mini barbershops in there, if you will. And so they don't need to leave. Others, again, have a refrigerator they can go to and grab a sandwich. So they don't need to leave those spaces. They've created an opportunity or an environment where they don't need to leave their actual team setting to even interact with other athletes. And so, you know, for me as a former athlete, and even some colleagues that I've talked to that are former athletes, you know, it does a disservice to them. There's benefit in them interacting outside of that space. If anything, again, to build their network, to build a support system, to talk to other individuals that have sort of shared interests. And so that's a push I really want our athletic departments, our coaches to sort of consider in their day-to-day, is not necessarily loosening the reins, but allowing those young people to know that there's life beyond athletics. And that is also a helpful rule of practice, in my belief, when we talk about the mental health and them transitioning. Because some of the other work I do is this notion of athletic retirement and transition. If they do get injured, if it is time to make that transition and their eligibility is ending, that it becomes abrupt. And so even in the state of COVID right now, I was brought in to speak with an athletic team here at San Jose State University, in particular the women's swimming and diving team that have about, I think, 12 young women that are graduating, and they missed the end of their season. They're all graduating. And, you know, the gist of the conversation, without giving any specific detail, was, well, what do we do next? You know, and helping them prepare. But again, if we start these things as they come in, build these networks as they come in, they become ongoing practices, I believe they'll have a smoother transition into, again, identifying life after college, identifying with their fitness routine. Because again, sport, for many of them, they're starting at ages 3, 4, and 5, to know you can still have that be a part of your life. But how do I live life now without my coach, my teammates, and that rigid schedule that we have for training and classes and social opportunities? And that's the thing I want at the end of the day. And I think that's what we talk about even, you know, with our institute, is wanting to have our young people that we work with, have our college athletes, our professional athletes, be able to have that opportunity for life beyond sport, to continue to know that sport is a part of them,
right?
But
Absolutely.
To continue to go on. Yeah.
Well, Akilah, I appreciate you sharing all that information. You've given us some great insight into what's going on. Thank you so much for sharing all of that detail with us today. We appreciate you being here, and we look forward to having you back, because I think there's a lot more for us to discuss.
Oh, definitely, definitely. We've got some things upcoming. I'll be talking about mentoring and some things and some other engagements that we have with other collaborative entities beyond the Institute. So please check us out. We've got some webinars on hand as well, with some great conversation with individuals, again, former athletes that do work in sport and social justice. And we want to definitely continue those conversations and have you meet all of those individuals and listen to those topics that we have.
Thank you so much. We appreciate your time and generosity and sharing all of that insight. And we look forward to having you involved in future events and seeing what else we can do to support all of your work.
Thank you so much. We appreciate it here at the Institute in California.
Have a great day.
You too.
And to all our listeners, thank you for joining us. We look forward to having you back for our next episode.